Welcome to our remote learning produce food safety webinar series. My name is Ashley Skinner, and I'll be the host for today's webinar. This series is funded by the USDA and is led by our PI, Dr. Michelle Danieluk from the University of Florida Citrus Research and Education Center located in Lake Alfred, Florida. This project is in collaboration with Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University with PI Dr. Harriet Paul, who's located in Tallahassee, Florida. Our overall goal with this community outreach project is to develop innovative and engaging remote learning produce food safety curriculum that is highly accessible to diverse growers, particularly small and beginner farmers, in order to equip them with the necessary food safety awareness and the skills to adopt proven food safety risk reduction practices. To do so, one of our aims is to deliver instructor-led workshop webinars to diverse audiences across Florida and the US. Today, we have two participants from FAMU, one from the Office of International Agriculture Programs, and the other from the School of the Environment. Please welcome Faith Clark and Armando Moraine. And finally, we have Dr. Renee Goodrich from the University of Florida. She is a professor in the Department of Food Science and is our featured presenter to teach us about record keeping. Take it away, Dr. Goodrich.
Okay, thank you so much, Ashley, and hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Obviously, we are not going to cover everything there needs to be covered on record keeping as it pertains to the farm, but we're going to have hopefully a good overview, and by the end, I've convinced you that record keeping is an important part of food safety. So, as you all know, a grower, a successful farmer has to keep track of many different things, financial things, rainfall, adverse weather events, what's going on any given day, who the harvesting crew is, the inventory of their farm equipment, and also expenses and output sales. But today we're going to focus on a specific kind of records, and that is food safety related records. And we always have sympathy for the growers who, when having to show their food safety plans, we know they have to keep track of many other things, and we tend to have a one-track mind in the food safety business and concentrate on those food safety records. But that's what we're going to do today. But I just want to acknowledge there are many other things that have to be kept track of. So record keeping pertaining to food safety isn't all that long of a history formally for produce. I come from the processed food industry. I moved to Florida to work in the citrus processing industry, and that industry had historically quite a few records because they were regulated heavily by FDA. But produce has a little bit of a shorter history, coincides with when I started with the university. It was right around 1998, 1999 when food safety became a little bit more organized and formal with FDA, and they had this thing called Good Agricultural Practices. We nickname it GAPS. And that was the first time I had ever seen a recommendation for record keeping as it pertained to growing produce. And this was to make sure that the grower could do this thing called trace back, looking one step forward to whom they sold the product, the customer, and then looking one step back, the field, the farm, the harvest site of that particular commodity. And it was thought if everybody did their part in keeping records on who it was sold to and who the various items were purchased from, that there would be this chain of knowledge of being able to trace something from literally field to fork. That was, again, quite a few years ago, but that eventually evolved into what we know as the USDA Good Agricultural Practices, Good Manufacturing Practices audit, and then eventually to other audits. As food safety became more and more important to the produce industry, a lot of these things began to be discussed in quite a bit more detail. Farmers were always keeping track of what seed they planted, yields from their fields, But now they had to actually document it and write it down. And that's really what we mean by records. It's the written documentation of things that happen. We're going to focus the rest of this discussion with kind of the produce safety rule floating around our head. I'm not going to give the record keeping lecture part of produce safety rule, but I'm going to lean on it heavily as recommendations of how we want to keep records, even if you aren't subject to the PSR, as we nickname that. It's what's expected in various parts of the produce industry if you want to sell your product to customers. So we're going to have that in mind, and most of this presentation is based on that. But we also know we have other audit and inspection schemes. A big one is the USDA harmonized audit, which actually brought together sort of the good agricultural practices along with the produce safety rule. And so all of these various records required by these schemes, as they're called, are generally very similar. There's obviously differences among all the different systems, but we all want to kind of verify the same aspects of food safety, things pertaining to agricultural water, things pertaining to how we clean our field bins. So again, that's a little bit of background of why we're even worried about records and record keeping. So let's talk a little bit about record keeping in terms of some general principles. And many of you know this from school or from other jobs that you've had. When you keep a lab notebook, you want to make sure what you write down is correct. And we're basically doing the same here with general record keeping. So we want to actually, when there's a value required, if we have to put a time in, we want to actually put that specific time in, not just a check mark or sometimes a yes, that you've looked at it, the person monitoring it has looked at it, and it has to be an actual and true observation. Some of these records are indeed legal documents. So we want to make sure that to the best of our ability, that is actually the accurate observation. Some of us have bad handwriting. I am one of them, but records do have to be legible, including signatures and initialing. And in some cases, that is part of the training that goes into how telling an employee how they need to fill out records. They have to have something more than just a little kind of thing that looks like a star, as my signature tends to look like. We have to have specific people authorized to sign and initial those records. We wouldn't want to put somebody there that wasn't trained in that area. Always date whatever it is you're writing. We want to have things in permanent ink. Our records do need to be permanent. Here I'm talking about non-electronic records. I'll mention electronic records a little later on. But if we are using something to write it, we obviously want the ink to be permanent. And I know people hate to make mistakes. Maybe they accidentally mark down a wrong number and kind of want to erase it, make it look pretty. But again, we just want it to be permanent. And if you make a mistake, you just simply draw a line through it, initial that, and put in the right value. Records should be reviewed in a timely manner after they're completed. And various operations, that might be the end of every shift. It might be the end of every week, and we'll have some discussion on that. And the key thing is that you should never actually kind of review your own records, kind of like the checks and balances kind of thing. You want somebody like a supervisor or the food safety manager looking at the records. This is difficult in a small operation sometimes, where the farmer wears many hats, from food safety supervisor to the grower to the harvest manager. But best practices would be to have another set of eyes actually look at our records. So those are the general principles that hold for sort of all records, not just food safety records. From the PSR, the produce safety rule, and in the 21 CFR, I'm sure you've seen this 112 designation, which indicates the produce safety rule. It specifically says that when you do a record pertaining to food safety, it should have the farm name and location. Well, that makes sense. Monitoring records where you're actually looking at actual values of things like maybe the chlorine levels in your sanitizing solution or the temperature of a dump tank. Those have to have actual values. We need to have the information that proves that we're packing, growing, harvesting, whatever it says we are. So we have to have the covered commodity and its variety, and anything pertaining to a brand. Maybe somebody would pack for 2 different brands, so you would have that noted as well. And the key thing that we have to have in terms of identifying information is the lot number. And the lot number, of course, is that unique identifier that says this field or this row, even in some big fields, or this section. So we need to know, in order to be able to trace things back to a field if there's a problem, exactly where that field is. So that has
Dr.
to be.
Goodrich?
Yes, ma'am.
I'm so sorry. It appears we have a student who had a question.
Okay, that's totally fine.
Hi, I wanted to find out in the case of a farm where the owner also conducts some record logging from time to time, how can we ensure proper review of these records?
Well, ideally, it would be part of a food safety plan that you would already have in place. And again, a food safety plan doesn't have to be big and fancy. It can be a notebook of how you conduct all operations on your farm. And you would decide ahead of time what is appropriate for your operation. If you don't pack every day, then you might not need to review records as frequently as somebody who does. Ideally, you set the review time to basically catch any problems or issues while they're still amenable to being solved.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Okay, yeah, and feel free, Ashley, to let me know if somebody's raised their hand.
Thanks.
No problem.
Okay. So again, part of the other major things that would be on every single record pertaining to produce safety is obviously the date and the time. I think I've said that several times. And it's surprising how many times that's actually missing, and nothing is more possibly irritating to inspectors and auditors who are trying to understand what you've done to not have an accurate date there. So this is what we want to have on every single one of our produce related safety records. Also, again, specifically for the produce safety rule, but actually good practice. And most of what I say here, I've tried to note where I use produce safety rule language, but I have tried to use produce safety rule language that's in general for whatever you do is a good thing to do. You can store your records off-site. If you have a tiny little office with not enough file space, you can have them on another site. The key there is to be sure that you can access them easily and readily if they need to be accessed. And typically the time is 24 hours. And electronic records are acceptable as long as you can prove that you're using some sort of software that prevents the changing of data or tracks any sort of changes that happen.
Dr. Goodrich?
Yes, ma'am.
We have a student, Armando, who's has a question.
Okay.
Thank you. Since you are talking about electronic records, is there any suggested software that farmers can purchase for record keeping?
Not that we recommend typically. We find actually most growers can utilize just simple Excel spreadsheets to keep their logbooks. Again, and there's ways of protecting them from being changed, read-only, and again, we don't have any particular recommendations. The key is to make sure when you go ahead and sign off on those records, you know that they can't be changed in any way. My Adobe does that to me. Once I sign it, I can't change anything. And I see another hand, maybe?
Faith, did you have a question or you just have your hand raised?
Okay, so I'll keep going here and I'll keep a lookout for the hands. So again, we're talking about produce, and we know a lettuce leaf doesn't last 2 years, but our produce safety records do have to be kept generally 2 years from the time that they're created. So for instance, if you have let's think about a training record where we train possibly once a month during the season, and then we take a break and we start training again once we start the growing season again. If I have a record that I keep for this week, even though I might have had information from last year on it, I still have to keep that record from at least 2 years from the latest date that I've actually filled in that record. So that sometimes kind of gives you an idea how you might organize your actual logbooks, and often people do it by season or annually. We won't go deep into things like exemptions, as Ashley mentioned, but records supporting your request for a qualified exemption status should be kept as long as necessary. Now, when you ask for a qualified or kind of submit your information for a qualified exemption, we actually look back over the previous 3 years from where we're wanting that exemption. So obviously we have to keep records for more than 2 years when it comes to supporting those sales and to whom we sell that produce, so that we can get the qualified exemption. Same thing with the value of our produce. If we take a 3-year average, we're obviously going to have to keep our sales records for 3 years. But in general, for food safety logs, we're looking at 2 years. The thing about records is they can be viewed and copied during a regulatory inspection. The inspector has to verbally or from a written request ask that, but those records that pertaining to food safety, at least if you're under the produce safety rule, are in fact subject to regulatory inspection. We like to recommend, and it's not mandatory, that you mark all your records as confidential, just because, again, that's how you do your business, and that is a reminder to anybody who would look at those records from an inspection point of view, that those are important documents that should be kept confidential. That's all written into the agreements that you have when an investigator looks at your records. But again, that's an additional little check there. So let's get into. Yes, ma'am.
We have one more student who has a question.
Okay, Faith.
Hi again, Dr. Goodrich. My question is, do I have to show an FDA inspector all of my records if they're inspecting for the produce safety rules?
In fact, no, you don't. You don't have to show them records pertaining to anything other than what's required. If you're covered by the produce safety rule, what's required in the actual regulation, or what's required for food safety. So again, special varieties that you grow, your own calculations of your yield, for instance, those aren't within records that an inspector would have to look at. And so you have to know which ones they can look at and which ones they can't.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So like I said, now we're just going to spend the rest of our time going through a couple key areas of documentation or record keeping. One of the more interesting ones to me is in the produce safety rule. We know we grow things that are eventually going to be processed, and by processing I mean something that will reduce or inactivate microorganisms and enzyme. So for instance, if I'm growing pickling cucumbers that will be eventually sold to somebody who will pickle them, I might look to an inspector as if I need to be covered by the produce safety rule, but I will actually be able to show that inspector that since I'm selling these to somebody that is going to further process them, I am not considered, I receive an exemption for that. So if I was going to ship these little cucumbers out, I would have to have a statement with every shipment saying that they're not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms. And along with that, that kind of warning that goes along with the paperwork with those cucumbers. Along with that, every year I'm going to have to get an affidavit or a written documentation from the person or entity making the pickles saying that I will continue to process your product adequately for food safety. So it's kind of a give and take, and it's part of, again, the sales agreements between the seller and the customer. But I always thought that was an interesting document that is part of record keeping that you wouldn't necessarily think that you would have to do. So that is one interesting, I think, record. We talked a little bit before about the qualified exemption documentation, and that unfortunately does require that you put down your sales, because of course we're trying to see whether or not we fall within the total food sales, and then the produce sales, and then sales to various customers that would make us able to take a qualified exemption, which I'm sure you'll cover in a subsequent webinar. So here we have our 3 years of sales broken out, and that would be another type of documentation. But obviously have to back that up, not obviously, but you would want to back that up by receipts or actual kind of sales transactions, and make sure that you have everything ready for an inspector who would see if you were able to take that qualified exemption. That is a record that they check. And let me make a note here. I didn't put it in because I do know that there's a time limitation for this webinar, but many of these documents and suggested logs are available through the Produce Safety Rule, through the Cornell GAPS website, through UF-IFAS, and FAMU kind of previous work that we've done together. These logs exist, so you don't have to make brand new ones. So that would be a record that we have to keep, possibly. We know from the Produce Safety Rule that workers are incredibly important in maintaining food safety, so we have to make sure that we can document that they've been trained in food safety, and that's explicitly told in the Produce Safety Rule. This includes all sorts of things. If you go to a produce safety grower training and get a certificate, that is a record, a training record, and that would be a type of document that you'd keep in your records. But other things include when we go back to the farm and maybe train workers on farm about proper hand washing. We'll want to keep record that who took that training, who provided the training, what you covered. And again, it just is a simple little log of writing in the day and date and all those other important headers, and then saying we covered how to properly wash your hands and how to handle yourself if you're ill. And you would kind of staple that all together and put it into your record keeping system, whatever that might be. And that would be considered a training record. And we have similar things for harvesting. We've taught people how to harvest and prevent, kind of to be aware that you can't harvest something that's been potentially contaminated by animal feces. So again, knowing that they've been trained that way is something that we have to document, that harvesting crew knows not to pick up potentially contaminated product. Or we might actually go through a little mini workshop of how to properly clean an implement, some sort of shovel, for instance, that's used to remove animal scat. So all these things we want to make sure they're documented, and that way we can show who's ever interested. And it's not always an inspector. Sometimes auditors, sometimes people who are buying our produce want to know these things. We can show them that, yes, we're running an operation where our people are adequately trained. So worker training records are an important kind of bucket of things we want to think about. Water. Everybody knows that water is important in produce safety, and we're continuing to try and understand how water regulations are eventually going to evolve for the produce safety rule. But currently, as it stands right now in the produce safety rule, we know we have to keep some records, and we're likely to have to in the future, even as FDA continues to revise that rule. We want to know where our water goes, where it comes from. We want to understand our water system. So that is a record that we'll want to keep. Maybe you'll map that out, number your pumps, so you have a little map understanding where you get your water for ag operations. If you get your water from a municipality, maybe you're lucky enough to be able to have that option. You want to keep water records that you get every year from the municipal water source. You have to have your water tested, and eventually we know we'll have to be able to show that our water is suitable for production of produce. We'll have to have our testing, our analytical test results set aside. All these things go into records for water. There's many of these, and this is sometimes the more complicated and record heavy part of our operations, but we do that because water is so important and has been the source of previous outbreaks. So water related records are specifically noted in the produce safety rule as things we have to actually keep an eye on. Okay, biological soil amendments. Here we have a steaming pile of compost. And again, if you're perhaps an organic grower or a small grower who wants to run an operation that's not officially organic, but grown in an organic manner, we might add soil amendments that come from animals, again, biological soil amendments. And if you're a grower that actually makes your own compost and treats your own compost and then applies it to the field, you're going to have to keep a record showing that you know how to make safe compost. And there's compost workshops where those records are provided. And it's important to show that you are making compost that eventually will be safe enough to not transfer any animal related contamination onto the produce. And I do see your hand up, Faith.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Goodrich. I just have another question with regards to soil amendments. Are we saying that all soil amendments should be recorded? And I was just thinking, what if it's a case where the amendment does not necessarily pose any food safety risk, such as hay?
So if it's clean hay, we're probably okay. The rule reads as biological soil amendments. So things from animals, basically things that have a potential to transfer pathogenic bacteria that are in the guts of animals eventually onto our produce. So good question there. And that's what composting is. That's the activity, the time, temperature, and turning of those manure piles, where eventually they become hot enough and they break down and activate any foodborne pathogens. Not all growers actually make their own compost. It's actually harder than it looks. And many organic growers or people who want to grow with organic biological soil amendments will purchase their amendments. That is a little bit easier. You don't have to deal with making sure that you're properly composting, but you do have to have records from the supplier of that compost saying those biological soil amendments of animal origin have been treated in a validated way. And like I said, I'm not a compost expert, but there are people that are, and they'll run workshops and teach you how to make safe compost. You also have to have in your food safety plan or in the supplier's food safety plan, although typically in yours, a way of showing that you don't contaminate your nice safe compost with any kind of other biological soil amendments that happen to be around. So you have to prove that once you get your supply of compost in, that you take care of it and don't, for example, intermix it with possibly chicken litter or something else. So soil amendments are key records, and they're interesting to me because not only do you have to document how you're handling them on the farm, you actually have to know something about making compost safely. Sanitation records. This is kind of near and dear to my heart. I started my food science career working on third shift, supervising sanitation. So everywhere there's food, we know we need to clean and sanitize things, and that holds true for what's happening out in the field. So this record would be kind of pertaining to how we actually handle our bins. How do we clean them? And growers have to come up with a way of showing that they are properly cleaning every bin that would come in from the field before it goes back out. And if you're this is, of course, pertains to covered harvested product. And usually this also includes not only a log sheet saying, yes, I clean the bin, but also what we call an SOP, a standard operating procedure. So often on the back of this record log where it said on this date, this time, I cleaned the following numbered bins, you would actually have a document that tells exactly how you were supposed to have done that. Again, that's part of the food safety plan. It's not a record you look at necessarily every day and not a record that you fill in, but in fact is a document that we consider as part of this kind of whole arena umbrella of record keeping. This is also where some of our training logs that are more specific than just teaching a harvesting crew how to not harvest around a potential contamination area. This is where we would show that we've trained somebody in how to properly clean something. And you can't clean a dirty service, or you can't sanitize a dirty service. First you have to clean it and then you have to sanitize it. So this is where we would also show that our folks or ourselves know how to properly clean a agricultural bin, for example. And this is also where the records of the actual strength, type of cleaner and sanitizer you use, this is where all that is recorded. In some cases, the actual concentration of the chemical is important. We know that from previous training that the concentration of the free chlorine, for example, is important. So sanitation records are also a set of records that we will expect to see in any food safety plan. So finally, kind of to summarize, and this is just a small sampling of records that you might run into. I do hope I've convinced you that record keeping is important. Again, maybe not the most exciting thing in the world to do, but it's important. And actually well-organized and accurate records will make your life much easier, especially as you prepare for an audit or for an inspection or for a customer visit. Hi, Amanda, I see a question.
Okay, yes, thank you. You just said record keeping is very important, but I will ask what could possibly happen if records are not properly kept? And I mean, let's see it like from two different perspectives, like what are the eventual consequences on their operations? And secondly, will they have to pay any fine or deal with anything similar?
It all depends on whether or not you're being regulated by FDA or just being visited by a customer, or just peace of mind as you kind of do your thing and grow produce. If you are growing covered produce under the FDA produce safety rule and your records do not indicate that you, or don't support that you're making safe food, there are different things that can happen, up to including fines and sort of bad things. But again, if you miss out on a sale from a potential customer because you don't appear to have a good handle on your food safety plan, or again, even kind of don't really know what's going on and don't feel comfortable about your record keeping, just not having that peace of mind is a negative thing. So I'm not sure exactly in every case what would happen, but I do strongly feel that having good records makes you happier.
Thank you.
It sounded a little dramatic, but there you go. This is a talk on record keeping. Like I said before earlier in the talk, there's many resources available. You don't have to start from scratch. You don't have to be real fancy. Just putting this together, I found many different logs that can be used as templates. And here the caveat is to use all the templates that are available. People are currently using them, but make sure that you've kind of customized that to your own kind of scope of operations and to what you actually do. And you wouldn't have a sanitation log that asked for instance, the level of chlorine concentration when you actually didn't use chlorine. So make sure that whatever you do adopt from the internet is something that pertains to yourself, or you kind of change that. We've mostly talked, like I said, about activity-based records, logs, times, but you want to have any of that supporting material that helps you know what you need to do, kind of all in the same place. So training materials, if you go to a workshop on water and get some actual more kind of in-depth water chemistry knowledge, you want to keep that all together. You'll certainly want to keep training certificates and certificates from your suppliers, that note from the pickle manufacturer that they're processing your cucumbers, and kind of guaranteeing that annually. Your municipal water records, you want to keep all of those together as well. You want to keep your SOPs, your standard operating procedures, kind of in the same way, kind of in the same general area. And again, any supplier ingredients and spec sheets that are part of your operation. So when we say records, we mean lots of other things. Often it's paper, and paper has a way of multiplying, it seems. But if you are organized in a fairly straightforward food safety manual kind of way, and there's sample food safety plans out there too, that should go a long way towards making sure that you have the records that you would need at any given time. We do know from the FDA informally, because it's rarely will they make a big pronouncement over the internet, but we do know that FDA sees lack of accurate record keeping as one of the areas where growers maybe could do a little bit better. So that is the overall basis for this talk. So I went a little bit over, but I hope I've convinced you about records.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goodrich. This was an amazing webinar that we were able to view. If there are any other questions, now's the time to raise your hand. Dr. Goodrich is able to be reached via email. I think your first slide, did you have your email listed in your first slide, Dr. Goodrich?
I might have. I don't.
If you could just go to the first slide in your slideshow. For those who are watching this webinar, if you have any other questions regarding record keeping for food safety, please feel free. Oh, it's not.
I did not, but Ashley, you know how to get a hold of me, and
Yeah.
I think
So,
everybody else does too.
Okay, so just
Yeah.
for you to have on file, if you need to reach Dr. Goodrich, she can be reached at goodrich at ufl.edu, GOODRICH at ufl.edu. And also, please make sure to enroll in like a FSMA training. You will be able to learn more about this topic. All right, have a great day.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.